just reflecting on the fact that governments have been urging us to maintain social distancing, but you make the clear distinction between physical and social distancing. Can you speak to that a little for us?
Yes, thanks, Lynn, and good morning, everyone who's joined us. I think it's very unfortunate that not just in Australia but around the world, the term social distancing has become the standard term for how we are supposed to interact with each other at a safe distance. Obviously, we do need to keep our physical distance, a spatial distance between us, in the interests of curbing the spread of COVID-19. But the more we have to remain physically distant from each other, the more urgent is our need for social connection. We belong to a species which, like most of the species on planet Earth, by the way, consists of social beings who need each other. We absolutely rely on our social connections to nurture us and sustain us and inspire us and support us and even to give us our sense of identity. So we're like herd animals, and when any herd animal is cut off from the herd, they become anxious and potentially depressed and various other forms of illness that are well documented among humans who experience social isolation. So here we are in a situation where, on an unprecedented scale, we're being asked to socially isolate. What that means is we've got to ramp up in every way we can, substitute connections that will keep us engaged with the human herd, not just with family and friends and colleagues, but even with other people who we encounter in cyberspace beyond our immediate circle. That need becomes more urgent when we're physically distant.
And yeah, indeed, you make that point in your book, Australia Reimagined, where you say the kind of compassion that builds social cohesion is not reserved for the marginalised, but rather needs to be infused across all society. So I suppose that's what you're saying there, that it's not really, it's that seeing the society as a whole.
Yes, yes, and also I think an important part of that quote is the idea that compassion can become a way of life. I think one of the problems about the word compassion, as it's being currently used, is that people think of it as an emotional state. They think you have to feel something in response to someone else in order to behave compassionately towards them. An unemployed person or a homeless person or a person with a disability, they might somehow appeal to us and bring out a compassionate response. I think that is completely misguided. I think of compassion not as an emotional state at all, but as an entirely rational mental discipline. In fact, the only rational response we can make to an understanding of what it really means to be human. Once we get the idea that we are a social species, that we need communities, neighborhoods, families, colleagues, we need all of those things to make us fully human, to allow us to live a rich human life, what other way should we behave towards each other except kindly, charitably, tolerantly, inclusively? That seems to me just to be sensible. And if we think of compassion as waiting for some emotional response to happen, we'll miss the whole point. The test of whether we've got what compassion is whether we can display compassion towards people we don't like or people we don't agree with and could never agree with about religion or politics or anything else. That's the test of whether we're civilized, and a civilized society, a civilized city like Ballarat, runs on compassion, runs on this idea that regardless of how we feel about each other, we will nevertheless behave compassionately towards each other.
Yes, we're picking up that a point that compassion is action, and I know Paul Gilbert talks about compassion as a motivation. So, as you rightly say, not an emotion, which is really important. And in terms of that action, clearly COVID-19 has required Australians to take action to demonstrate that they care more for others than for themselves. By definition, that's what we're all doing with our isolation. So how do you suggest that we can take that wider social focus back into the post-COVID world, as clearly that's going to require a radical rethink of individualism, which has been in vogue for many years now?
Absolutely. On that last point, I think we are, like all Western societies, now the victims of a culture of individualism, often referred to as the me culture, where now for, well, at least half a century, perhaps a century, we've been edging in the direction of losing sight of ourselves as members who belong to families, neighbourhoods, communities, societies, and thinking of ourselves more as individuals with our own rights and our own entitlements and so on. So the best possible thing that could happen as a result of this pandemic is that we could realise fully the lesson that a pandemic actually teaches us, which is that we are all utterly interconnected, we are all interdependent, and the idea that the main way to think about ourselves is as individuals is just simply crazy. Now, how are we going to carry that, as you say, into our lives post-COVID-19? Well, my answer is a very simple one, Lynn. I think we have to start in the neighbourhood. We realise at a time like this that neighbours are actually very important to us. We realise that there is this special category or special dimension of our role as citizens. We know about our role as partners or parents or siblings or colleagues or people who play football together or whatever it might be. In a culture of individualism, it's very easy to forget this other particular role that we call neighbour. Neighbours are not necessarily our friends. They sometimes become friends, but they're not like friends. They're not like family members. They're people in a very strange category, people who share our immediate living space with us, people who walk along the same footpath, exercise in the same park, go for coffee at the same little coffee shop. And the neighbourhood is really the test bed of how compassionate we are. The interesting thing about neighbours, unless you're a very odd person who interviewed everybody in the street before you decided to rent or buy your house or apartment where you live, most of us find where we want to live, find a suitable dwelling, move in, and then we find we've got all these people living around us who are our neighbours, and to their great amazement, we, the strange person who's just moved in, we are their neighbours. And this is a particular role that we have as human beings to act in a neighbourly way. That means kindly and compassionately and inclusively towards those people who are accidentally closer to us most of the time than anybody else. So I think that's where we start when we come out of this. I think the way we need to first apply the lessons we're learning from this experience of the pandemic is let's re-engage with the neighbourhood, because if we get that right, then we're a long way towards creating the compassionate society that we dream of.
Mm. Yeah, start with those closest to us. Yes, yeah. As you know, we were to have you here in Ballarat in May to speak about your two new books. So they are The Inner Life, which is a non-fiction book, and your new novel, The Question of Love. But we'll now need to wait until at least the end of the year for that. And, you know, going to your point of connecting to others at a time of difficult this difficult time, that's sometimes the time where we find it hardest of all. And so in thinking about how we can actually connect to our neighbours and people around us when we're feeling that sort of stress. And I know for me, having that in mind, I can see you at the gallery doing the talk and giving that talk. And we don't know when that is, but I know that it will happen. So I wonder what advice then, so that's one thing that I'm doing, having this image in my mind to take us through to, when life goes back to normal. But I wondered if you had advice for, what we can do while we're being held in this space. I've heard it referred to as a liminal space where it's a transitional time, and it is a difficult time when you're trying to connect to others.
Yes, I think of it as the world having pressed the pause button, and this is both exciting and a terrific opportunity, and also very threatening and quite scary for a lot of people. But that's what it's like. I mean, we haven't pressed the pause button if we're parents of young children working from home and trying to supervise schoolwork and trying to run a household. I mean, it's a busier time than ever. But for other people, this is a less busy time. It's an opportunity to jump off the busyness treadmill. And I think there are two things we can be doing while we're in this strange interregnum, in this pause period. One, of course, is to acknowledge that we are incredibly lucky compared with, for example, the Spanish flu 100 years ago. Yes, we're being isolated and told to stay home, etc. But in 2020, we've got this brilliant technology, such as the technology we're using right now, which allows us to maintain very close contact. Yet it's not the same as face-to-face, but with people we know, it's not a bad substitute to be able to ring up, send text messages, emails, have Zoom conferences, and all these things. So use the IT, use the technology as much as you can as a substitute to maintain and enrich personal relationships, to nurture personal relationships through this period. The other thing I'd strongly suggest is the very opposite of that, and that is to make time every day to be disconnected from the technology, to put the smartphone away out of sight, to lower to create a barrier between your work time and your heavy socializing time and your downtime. Here's an opportunity which we are very rarely given, to have space in our day when we could just do nothing, where we could just sit and dream and reflect and introspect and ask ourselves the questions we don't usually have time to ask, like, who am I really? Am I living in a way that's consistent with the values that I claim to espouse? Am I making the sort of contribution to our city or to our society that I feel I could make? I mean, quite deeply reflective, introspective questions. We've got time for that now. And I think if each day we can just put aside a little bit of time for that, we're going to come out of this experience in far better shape.
Yes. I just am aware that for people who are unemployed and have a lot of children in the house and have mental illness, in homes where there's domestic violence or mental illness, that it's harder, isn't it, for people to see this time as a time of reflection.
Oh, absolutely. I'm talking about the fortunate people in the community who are not in that situation or any of those situations you just described, Lynn. But actually, I think another one of the benefits, if I can put it in that way, of the pandemic is we are now all being asked to socially isolate, to self-isolate. And we know that this is temporary, and we know we can go out for a walk, and we know we've got access to IT to connect us with family and friends and colleagues and so on. Spare a thought for people grappling with a disability, mental illness, homelessness, people who've lived alone for years and are frail and elderly and so on. In other words, there are people in our community, thousands and thousands of them, who are almost permanently socially isolated. And if our experience of this in a limited, temporary way sharpens our awareness, deepens our compassion towards those who are socially isolated by virtue of their permanent circumstances, and if we can then become more aware of them, more generous towards them. If we don't know anyone who we can support in a personal way, we certainly know the charities who look after those people, and we could be far more generous in supporting them. I think it's an excellent point, Lynn. Thank you.
So I might take some questions now. I will start. I can see Terry Ailing has a question there. As I mentioned, Hugh, you are the ambassador to the Australian Compassion Council. In your book, Australia Reimagined, you say that social cohesion grounded in compassion and mutual respect is the key to greatness for any society. So I was wondering, what does that kind of Australia look like to you, and how can the Australian Compassion Council help in realising that vision?
To me, greatness absolutely can be captured in one word, and that word is equality. True equality, so that no one in any category, including those we were just discussing, ever feels as if they are on the margin or overlooked or in some way diminished by their particular situation or their status. And equality as a goal, I mean, Australia used to be passionate about the dream of egalitarianism. We're less passionate now. I think we need to rethink that, to think what equality really means. Equality between the first peoples and the more recent arrivals, equality between men and women and people at other points on the gender spectrum, equality between the employed and the unemployed, equality between the highly intelligent and the cognitively impaired. We often overlook that kind of inequality. And what drives the process of reaching that goal of a society that enshrines equality, what drives it, of course, is compassion. We'll only achieve that kind of equality in our society if we embrace compassion as the modus operandi, as the motivation.
Yes, yes. Well, we will continue to talk about, what that means for the Australian Compassion Council as well, and how we support that in our work. I have a question from Mary Hollick. What initiatives would you like to see to ensure that those who are not IT connected are given that opportunity?
Yes, when we're talking about things like a universal basic income, which we haven't actually embraced, but we're having a rough go at it at the moment, I think the way the world has gone, it should be appropriate for people who can't afford to equip themselves with the technology to link them to the internet and to have the sort of opportunities we're enjoying right at this moment. I think that should be part of our basic provision for those people who are disadvantaged in that way. But of course, the other thing I'd say about such people is that we have a personal responsibility. If there's someone in your street or in your apartment block who you know is not connected via information, that's the person that you need to be going and smiling at and calling out hello and picking some lemons and leaving them on their doorstep. I mean, we can very easily feel connected and included courtesy of this technology. But in the short term, until we work out a way to provide the technology to those who can't otherwise afford it, we've got to make sure that no one is left to feel socially excluded. That they are our primary responsibility.
One of the issues that came up in our last week's webinar was about looking after children in this time, and I wondered if you had any comments on how we look after our children.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents are having the shock of discovering what it actually means to be a full-time parent when they had geared their lives to being, as it were, part-time parents. In other words, to have full-time work outside the home and to rely on the school or childcare to look after their children. Now, in many cases, they're having to face what it actually means to have a child in the house, and it's very testing. As I said earlier in our conversation, Lynn, if you are trying to work from home and you're you're trying to look after kids and supervise their schoolwork, etc., plus do all the normal things involved in running a household, then this is a very, very stressful time. And I think those of us who are grandparents or aunts and uncles or neighbours should do everything we can to ease that pressure on parents who are in a hothouse of 24-hour-a-day parenting through phone calls. And I mean, I drive over to my youngest grandchildren live about half an hour away from me. The rest are scattered all over Australia. I rely on texts and phone calls for them. But these, once a week, I just drive over and leave some jokes or puzzles and a card and a chocolate frog or something on the doorstep, just to maintain the idea that there is someone apart from their immediate parents who's thinking about them as well. But yes, anything we can do to relieve that load on the parents, certainly we should be doing. It's very hard at the moment. I mean, you can't just go next door to play with the kids and give the parents a break, because that's clearly outside the regulations at the moment.
So Robert has asked a question: what is the best way for organisational leaders to demonstrate and role model compassion?
In the present circumstances, or does that mean in general?
Probably in general, I'd say.
General, yes. Yes, I mean, it's a wonderful question. Well, let's take it as a general question, but there's also a specific answer, I think, in the present context.
Okay.
The general point is that good leadership is always compassionate leadership. We talk about strong leaders as though that means tough, inflexible, steamroller leaders. Good, visionary, sensitive leaders who understand that leadership is the ultimate form of service, understand that as an inbuilt characteristic that they need to be sensitive, inclusive, responsive to the needs of those they lead. In other words, driven by compassion. It's the primary requisite of good leadership. In the present circumstances, that the extent of that compassion is being tested by managers, leaders, proprietors, bosses whose workers are working remotely under often very difficult circumstances. For example, if there are young children in the house. I heard yesterday of a person working under those conditions who said that her boss is just extraordinary, just saying, look, I know what we're all going through. I don't expect 100% performance from everyone under these conditions, but I do expect everyone to do the best they can and to get in touch with me if they're having difficulties. I'm not counting the hours you're working. I'm just hoping that you'll get through the work each week. Now that's a generous, that's a sensitive, it's a flexible attitude. And all of that springs from this magic word, compassion.
Good. I just finished with this question, which has come from Denise and Terry, about how do we ensure that we hold the potential learnings, that positive learnings that come out of this experience. Too often we can have a major experience and it not change us, and especially if that's applied right across the society. We've just had the bushfires and we thought that we were going to have, changes from that. and here we are hit with another, sort of issue bigger issue to connect with.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
just wondering
I think,
about how do we lock in those pro-social behaviours that we really, have the opportunity to take from this experience.
yes. Thanks, Lynn, and thanks for that question. Um, the Great Depression of the 1930s. There aren't many Australians. There's still some older Australians who were young adults or adolescents growing up in that period, and what they say is it changed them forever. They learned, they got their values straight, they got their priorities straight, they learned the value of the neighbourhood, they learned the value of self-sacrifice, they learned to look out for others who might be in more desperate situation than they are. And that never left them. I talked in my research career to many people from that generation, and invariably they said it was the Depression that formed these values, and they were a bit worried about what a more affluent society, a more self-centered society would do to our values. So I think this radical shift in our way of living temporarily in the context of the pandemic will change us. I'm optimistic that it will change us, but I recognise that some people will want to just go back to exactly the way it was. I heard someone say yesterday, when this is over, we don't want to bounce back, we want to bounce forward. In other words, we want to move in a different direction. And so here's a responsibility for all of us. There are roughly 40 of us gathered at this moment, and others who might hear this recorded later. We as individuals need to be sure that we don't just bounce back, that we do bounce forward, that we are still going to maintain the sort of connections, the sort of engagement, especially at the local neighbourhood level, that we've learned to do during this period. It would be a tragedy if it turned out that the only time we know how to be good neighbours is when there's a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you, Hugh. That was just wonderful. I'd actually like to finish with the challenge that you outlined in your 2019 Australia Day address. I think it's very apt, where you asked Australians to dream of a kinder, more compassionate, more generous, more equitable Australia. Because if enough of us are prepared to act as if we are already living in that society, then that's the kind of society Australia will become. So thank you once again, and we so look forward to your being in Ballarat and hearing about your new books. As I've mentioned, with each of these webinars, we're finishing with a mindful practice. So I just take the next few moments to really make sure that everyone's taking a deep breath, that your feet are grounded, that you are breathing deeply and rhythmically. And while you do that, I'd just like to read this reflection on a pandemic. So for those of us who are merely inconvenienced, let's remember those whose lives are at stake. For those of us who have no risk factors, let's remember those who are most vulnerable. For those of us who have the luxury of working from home, let's remember those who must choose between protecting their health or making their rent. For those of us who have the flexibility to care for our children when schools are closed, remember those who don't have those options. For those of us who are losing our margins in the money markets, remember those who have no margin at all. For those of us who are able to quarantine at home, let's remember those who have no home. As fear grips our country, let us choose love. During this time when we cannot physically wrap our arms around each other, let us find new ways to be the loving embrace for our family, friends, neighbours, and those in our community we hardly know. So thank you everyone for attending today, and we look forward to next week's webinar, which is from Justin Wilbur. Justin is the founder of Aussies and Kiwis for Anzacs. In the lead up to the first Anzac Day, where people are not able to gather, Justin decided to set up a Facebook page asking Australians to stand at the end of their driveways at 6 a.m. on Anzac Day, holding a candle, or the app he has developed for a minute's silence. And that initiative has gone global. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Justin next Wednesday. Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.